The neighborhood of Willow Creek was quiet, uniform, and governed by rules that seemed harmless at first glance. It was the kind of planned community where lawns were measured for height, mailboxes were inspected for uniformity, and each house was nearly identical. Beneath the neatness, however, was a brewing system of control, fueled by power-hungry board members of the Homeowners Association. Most residents complied to avoid conflict. Others tried to resist, only to discover how ruthless an HOA could become. But no one had ever pushed back hard enough to make a difference. Until now. At the edge of the neighborhood sat a two-story brick home belonging to a quiet, solitary man named Thomas Reed. He had moved to Willow Creek 3 years earlier, drawn by its reputation for being peaceful and safe. He was not the sort of neighbor who sought attention or social involvement. He kept to himself, maintained his property with care, and worked long hours as a systems analyst. Nothing about him stood out, except perhaps that he seemed content being left alone. And that small independence was enough to catch the attention of the people who enjoyed control. The first letter from the HOA seemed simple, routine, non-threatening. A soft reminder slipped inside a bright white envelope stamped with red ink. It claimed he owed $50 for a violation of community standards, trash can visibility. According to the letter, his trash can had been visible from the street on a weekday that was not designated pickup day. Thomas barely remembered leaving the bin slightly out of line. He had pulled it in from the street but must have left it by the side of the garage rather than returning it behind the wooden privacy screen like he normally did. He assumed it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, something easily cleared up. He reviewed the bylaw mentioned in the citation, Rule 14, Section 3. Trash receptacles must be stored out of public view within 24 hours of weekly pickup. He remembered clearly that he had moved the bin the same evening after work. He had not left it out for more than a few hours. He had not violated any rule. He considered ignoring the letter, assuming a mistake had been made. But the HOA had a rule for that too. Ignore fines, and they would compound. He wrote a short email to the HOA office explaining the situation. He attached a photo from his door camera showing that the trash bin had, in fact, been moved by late evening. He expected a polite response. Instead, he received a short message declaring the photo insufficient proof and asserting that the fine remained valid. Moreover, a $10 processing charge was added for the time it took a compliance officer to review his request. That was when Thomas realized something was off. The HOA board at Willow Creek was led by a woman named Cheryl McAllister. Her name was whispered among residents not with respect, but with fear. Stories circulated about her stepping down from a corporate executive job and pouring her energy into neighborhood order. Under her leadership, fines increased, rules became stricter, and enforcement more aggressive. Every year the HOA budget grew, yet no one in the neighborhood saw where much of the money actually went. Thomas had heard these things before, but dismissed them as gossip. Now, however, it was starting to feel personal. Still, he had no desire for a fight. He sent another email requesting a meeting with the board to dispute the fine. The reply he received was curt and dismissive. The fine now had an additional late administrative penalty, bringing his total to $85. The email ended with a thinly veiled threat. Continued refusal to pay could result in legal action or a lien on his home. A lien over a trash can. It sounded absurd. This was the kind of blem people joked about, HOAs obsessing over ridiculous rules. But liens were not a joke. A lien meant the HOA could seize his home. All over a $50 fine he didn't even owe. Something in him shifted. Irritation became alertness. Tension replaced indifference. Something was wrong here, seriously wrong. He pulled out the HOA's financial reports from previous years, documents that were technically public but rarely requested by residents. He expected neat accounting, transparent spending, and normal operating budgets. But what he found was strange. Large lump sum withdrawals were categorized vaguely under community services and operational assessments. Thousands of dollars went to consulting fees paid to a company with no website. Landscaping charges appeared wildly inconsistent, sometimes doubling or tripling over a few months. Even more suspicious, there were legal fees paid to a law firm run by Cheryl's brother-in-law. Patterns began to emerge, patterns that hinted the HOA was more than strict and controlling. It might be deeply corrupt. The pressure tactic used against him, a bogus fine over something trivial, was not incompetence. It was a system of intimidation designed to keep residents compliant and money flowing. Days passed. More letters arrived. The tone became harsher. They claimed he now owed $135, then $185, then $220. Each notice layered with threats about collections, legal escalation, and loss of property rights. He recorded every letter, saved every email, documented every charge. The stronger their threats became, the calmer he grew. The HOA saw a quiet homeowner they thought they could push around. What they didn't see was a professional trained in identifying system loopholes, analyzing data, and building strategies that crush weak structures. And the HOA's structure was weaker than it appeared. He attended the next HOA board meeting, not to argue, but to observe. The conference room at the community center smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Board members sat at a table like royalty judging the peasants' woo, lined the chairs before them. Compliance officers flanked them like guards. Residents who spoke were dismissed quickly, silenced by scripted responses. Everything about the meeting was controlled. Everything was staged to discourage dissent. That night, Thomas did not confront anyone. He simply watched, listened, learned. He noted the board's procedures, their voting style, the way Cheryl dominated discussion and shut down any member who questioned her. He noticed the silence from the other board members, either out of fear or loyalty. He also noticed something else, the residents. They looked tired, resigned, some angry, but too afraid to act. If someone stood up to this system, they would not be alone. And so, the HOA's mistake was not the $50 fine. It was believing Thomas Reed would bow to intimidation. They thought he would pay like everyone else. But they did not know who he was. They did not know he had time, resources, and a reason now. They did not know they had awakened something inside him that had been quiet for too long. He left that meeting planning something far larger than a dispute letter. He was going to tear the board apart, not with anger, but with strategy. They wanted to play legal games. He would show them what a real legal war looked like. The HOA had made a mistake, and soon they would pay for it. Thomas's first move was not dramatic. There were no picket signs, no viral videos, no midnight raids. The real work was quieter, more methodical, and far more dangerous to the HOA's fragile empire. He began by building a record, an immovable stack of documented facts that would later be immune to the board's rehearsed denials and scripted replies. He turned his home office into an evidence room, printing financial statements, transcribing meeting minutes, and cataloging every interaction with the HOA. Where the board relied on vagueness and arbitrary enforcement, Thomas relied on transparency and precision. He immersed himself in the HOA governing documents. The restrictive covenants, bylaws, and rules were dense and stuffed with legalese. They read like a maze meant to confuse and intimidate the average homeowner. He annotated every clause, highlighted inconsistencies, and marked instances where enforcement procedures deviated from the written rules. He studied the process for levying fines, the timeline for hearings, and the responsibilities of the board. He found more than one place where the board's actions directly contradicted the language of their own charter. The bylaws required documented warnings before fines were imposed, and a fair hearing if a resident contested a fine. The letters he had received, however, skipped those steps entirely. Next, he focused on the HOA's money. The financial reports he had downloaded were the skeleton. He needed flesh. He requested, under the state's laws governing homeowners associations, full itemized records for the past 5 years. The request was met with passive resistance, long delays, evasive responses, and eventually an automated email stating the documents were not available at this time. But the law offered remedies. Thomas filed a formal demand, citing statutes that required the board to provide records. The demand threatened legal action if the records were withheld. The tone of the board's emails shifted. The thinly veiled threats became cautious and then oddly conciliatory. The first tranche of documents arrived in a poorly scanned mess of PDFs, but the important pages were there. He hired a forensic accountant. It was an expense he did not relish, but the sums involved and the web of transactions suggested a pattern that needed professional eyes. The accountant was patient and meticulous, combing through inflated landscaping invoices, suspicious consulting payments, and the legal fees that seemed, disturbingly, to pad the pockets of Cheryl's allies. The account and confirmed what Thomas had feared. There were irregularities large enough to warrant formal complaint. Funds had been diverted in ways that benefited specific vendors and, by extension, board members. It was not just wasteful, it looked intentional. Evidence alone would not topple a board entrenched in fear and control. Thomas needed allies. For weeks he watched neighbors' faces at Saturday morning walks and at grocery store checkouts, looking for the same sense of frustration he felt. He began knocking on doors, but not the way an angry activist does. He knocked as someone who understood privacy and the instinct to avoid escalating conflicts. He offered copies of the documents and explained, without dramatic language, what he had found. Some neighbors shook their heads and closed doors. Others listened. Most admitted they had been quietly paying fines and accepting the steady erosion of community voice. A few, however, said they had felt the same frustration and had been waiting for someone to do something. Word spread slowly, then faster. A retired teacher named Evelyn provided minutes from past meetings she had kept in her purse for years. A young couple produced photos showing how their mailbox had been cited repeatedly for paint that matched every neighbor's paint, yet fines were levied only for some. An elderly man produced receipts proving that an allegedly contracted landscaping company had never performed the work billed to the HOA. Each contribution added texture and credibility to Thomas's case. He assembled binders and created a digital archive accessible to the residents he trusted. Transparency, he realized, would be his greatest weapon. When people could see the facts plainly arranged, the board's lies would shrink. He also began to document the board's internal procedures. He recorded, legally and discreetly, public portions of open sessions and elected statements from residents who had been ignored. He traced the relationships between vendors and board members, discovering more than just one or two cozy arrangements. There was a network of referrals, exchange of favors, and a culture that rewarded loyalty over accountability. The deeper he dug, the more obvious it became that the HOA was less a steward of the community and more a racket disguised as governance. Thomas prepared 2 parallel plans. The first was a legal offensive, a formal complaint to the state agency that regulated homeowners associations, supported by the forensic accountant's report and the documented evidence of improper fines and financial malfeasance. The second was a grassroots campaign to reclaim the HOA itself, elect new board members at the next annual meeting, propose changes to the bylaws, and restore transparency. Both plans required timing, precision, and the right mix of public pressure and legal leverage. He had to be careful. The HOA had power, and in Willow Creek, that power translated into a capacity for retaliation. He documented every interaction meticulously, aware that the board was already inventing pretexts for additional fines. He also prepared for personal attacks. When the first anonymous smear appeared, a printed flyer slipped under his neighbor's door accusing him of stirring trouble and seeking to profit from drama, he was not surprised. Instead of reacting angrily, he used it as proof of the board's fear. Someone was watching the campaign and trying to undermine it. That only confirmed the need for secrecy in certain aspects of his organizing. As Thomas moved forward, he discovered an unexpected moral complexity. Several board members were not villains. They were neighbors who had been seduced by power and by the ease of acquiescence. Their names, when publicly documented, did not fall neatly into categories of good and evil. That understanding did not stop him. Rather, it informed his strategy. He would not seek revenge for revenge's sake. He intended to restore balance and accountability. He wanted a governance structure that served the community, not one that preyed upon it. The timing of his legal filings was crucial. He coordinated the submission of the complaint with the release of the forensic accountant's findings, and with a confidential invite to a small group of residents to attend a community transparency briefing. Invitations went to those he knew would stand publicly for change. The briefing was held in a town hall room far too small to hold all the concerned neighbors, but it was enough to create momentum. At the briefing, he laid out the case without theatrics, presenting numbers, dates, and documented links between payments and board decisions. He explained the legal remedies he had filed for and outlined the process for nominating new board members. He made clear that the goal was not to humiliate, but to reform. At the end of the presentation, the room hummed with a sound Thomas had not heard in months at HOA meetings. Hope. Cheryl McAllister, when she learned of the briefing, reacted predictably. She sent a terse email to the mailing list reminding residents of the community standards and warning against outside influence and misinformation. Her email was a thin attempt to cast the reform movement as illegitimate. But her clumsy language and the defensive tone only confirmed what many had begun to suspect. It was no longer plausible that the board was acting in the community's interest. From a quiet complaint about a trash can, a coalition was building. The opposition was still fragile, but the foundations were solid. Documented evidence, legal support, and neighbors ready to reclaim the community. Thomas had turned the first panic-inducing fine into a catalyst for something far larger. The HOA that had thought to bully a solitary homeowner was now facing coordinated resistance backed by legal authority. The stakes were rising, and the next moves would determine whether Willow Creek would stay divided or finally become accountable. The transformation of Willow Creek from a controlled, silent neighborhood into a community bracing for change did not go unnoticed. While some residents quietly expressed relief that someone was finally challenging the HOA, others watched nervously from behind closed blinds. Fear lingered, mixed with uncertainty. Change was coming, and not everyone trusted it. But for the board, especially Cheryl McAllister, change was a threat. The morning after Thomas held the transparency briefing, retaliation began. It did not come in the form of a dramatic confrontation, but was instead carried out through quiet administrative aggression, the weapon of choice for those who wield bureaucratic power. 3 new violation notices arrived at Thomas's door before noon. One cited improper mailbox paint tone, despite the fact that his mailbox had been professionally painted to match the approved color code. Another claimed unapproved exterior lighting, even though his porch light was the standard issue provided by the original builder. The third was the most insulting, lawn height non-compliance, issued while his lawn was trimmed evenly and freshly cut. He logged every notice and added them to a growing folder labeled retaliation evidence. The pattern was too obvious to ignore. The HOA was escalating the conflict through harassment disguised as enforcement. It was a predictable but dangerous move. Retaliation by an HOA against a homeowner for exercising legal rights was illegal, but only if it could be proven. So Thomas did what he did best. He documented. He time-stamped photos, matched them against the time-stamps of the notices, and archived them alongside the HOA bylaws. Each violation letter became a brick in the case he was building. Word of the bogus violations spread quickly. Neighbors took pictures of their own properties and shared them with Thomas, showing similar absurd fines. One woman was fined for leaving her recycling bin visible for 11 minutes after pickup. She had security footage to prove the time. Another resident received a violation for yard decoration quantity exceeding limit because her 2 flower pots were labeled as visual clutter. The board was enforcing rules selectively, and now, strained under scrutiny, they pushed harder, blind to the fact that their behavior only fueled opposition. As tensions rose, Thomas received an anonymous warning letter in his mailbox. The note was handwritten and sloppy, with no signature. It claimed he was stirring up trouble and should stop before things get ugly. There was no mistaking the threat beneath the words. He scanned and filed it. It would become another piece of evidence, a sign that someone on the board, or a loyalist, was becoming desperate enough to act outside official channels. But Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he adapted. He began hosting small neighborhood meetings in his garage, informal gatherings with folding chairs and a portable whiteboard. He kept the tone practical and calm, focused on teaching rather than ranting. He walked neighbors through their rights as homeowners, explaining how to dispute illegitimate fines and request due process hearings under state law. He handed out templates for evidence requests and violation appeals. Knowledge became a weapon, and he was distributing it freely. The HOA had counted on residents being uninformed and afraid. They had not planned for someone willing to educate the neighborhood. Meanwhile, his legal efforts were gaining traction. The state investigator assigned to the case reached out to request additional documents, which meant the complaint had moved past the initial dismissal stage, an important milestone. The forensic audit findings had triggered concern. The investigator asked for a full timeline of interactions between Thomas and the board, including copies of the original $50 fine and the subsequent escalation. Thomas delivered everything in an organized binder with digital backups. He knew investigators were often overloaded with cases, and clarity increased the likelihood of action. But the most significant development came from inside the HOA itself. A board member named Michael Lane reached out to Thomas discreetly. Michael was quiet by nature and rarely spoke during board meetings. He had always voted with Cheryl, but now he admitted that he had begun to question the board's decisions. He confessed that he had not seen the full financial records himself. Budget reports were presented selectively, and Cheryl controlled what the board saw. The others trusted her, or at least, they feared opposing her. Michael provided insider insight into how decisions were made. Cheryl ran the board with strict authority, using intimidation and carefully placed fines to silence critics. She had built alliances by offering favors, such as waiving violations or extending deadlines, for residents she wanted on her side. Those who spoke up were targeted relentlessly until they complied or moved away. The HOA elections were barely contested because the process was intentionally confusing, and candidates required board approval to run. The system was rigged to keep Cheryl and her circle in control. Thomas recorded the conversation with Michael's permission and added it to the evidence archive. It was the first direct confirmation that the board's internal operations were compromised. And it gave Thomas another opportunity, a chance to fracture the board from within. He encouraged Michael not to resign, but to stay in position and quietly pass along information. With a board insider helping, the path forward became clearer. The timing of the annual HOA election was approaching. Flyers appeared announcing the nomination period, with confusing instructions written in small print. Historically, only a handful of board-approved candidates ran unopposed. This year would be different. Thomas had already begun forming a slate of candidates, residents with clean reputations, diverse backgrounds, and a desire for fair governance. He didn't present himself as a leader, but as an engineer of plans. His greatest contribution was structure. He organized nomination petitions, prepared candidate statements, and created a website documenting reform goals, financial transparency, fair enforcement, and the removal of corrupt members. The board's response was to tighten control, They issued a sudden amendment to the bylaws requiring candidates to be in good standing, meaning they could not have any outstanding violations or unpaid fines. It was a direct attack aimed at disqualifying Thomas and several supporters. But this maneuver was illegal. Amendments required community vote, not unilateral board declaration. The board had overplayed. Thomas sent a cease and desist letter to the board on behalf of the reform group, citing specific bylaw sections and state HOA statutes. He reminded them that their refusal to follow election procedures would constitute election fraud. The letter was not a bluff. It was backed by a pro bono community resident attorney who believed in the cause. The board ignored the letter, dismissing it as a scare tactic. That was a mistake. Thomas filed a motion for injunctive relief in county court, asking a judge to temporarily halt the election until proper procedures were restored. The filing sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. The HOA had never faced a lawsuit from one of its own residents. The community began to take sides. Some residents feared chaos, others embraced change. The board called an emergency meeting. It was during that meeting, packed with angry homeowners, that Cheryl finally addressed the growing conflict publicly. She attempted to reframe the lawsuit as a personal vendetta. But her speech fell flat. Her usual confidence seemed strained. Questions from residents grew sharp. Someone finally asked the question out loud: where was all the HOA money actually going? For the first time, Cheryl didn't have an answer. Control was slipping. The facade was cracking. The fight was no longer about a $50 fine. It had evolved into a battle for the future of the community. One side wanted control, the other wanted justice. The final confrontation was coming, and both sides were preparing for war. The emergency board meeting had not gone the way Cheryl expected. Instead of calming the residents or regaining control, it had exposed a vulnerability she had worked years to conceal. The HOA board was not invincible. Whispers now followed her whenever she walked through the neighborhood. Neighbors who once feared her now watched her with suspicion. Yet power rarely fades without resistance, and Cheryl was not the kind of person to surrender. The day after the meeting, something changed. The HOA went silent. No new violation notices were issued. No community announcements went out. The official website stopped posting updates. The board vanished from view entirely, as if retreating behind closed doors to craft a new strategy. But silence was not a sign of surrender. It was the calm before a calculated counterattack. Thomas knew better than to relax. He had pushed the board publicly, but now they would try to strike back quietly, through procedure, technicalities, and legal maneuvers. The lawsuit he had filed for injunctive relief had triggered judicial scrutiny over the election process, but Cheryl still controlled the narrative in the paperwork submitted to the court. She claimed the lawsuit was unnecessary, arguing that the board had always followed the bylaws and that the reform group was misinformed and disruptive. But Thomas anticipated the move. He filed a supplemental motion with exhibits, photographs of altered election notices, annotated bylaws, and statements from residents explaining procedural obstruction. The court had not yet ruled, but progress was slow. Meanwhile, the board was buying time. That time was used for something dangerous. Evidence of unauthorized actions began to surface. A landscaper quietly admitted that he had been approached by a board member to verify that certain homes, including Thomas's, were out of compliance, even if they were not. A delivery driver reported seeing someone in an HOA jacket taking photos of Thomas's property late at night. And a neighbor caught a man attempting to access Thomas's backyard gate after midnight. The man fled before he could be identified. It was no longer a bureaucratic fight. It had begun to feel personal. Thomas installed additional security cameras and informed the county sheriff's office of the suspicious activity. He did not yet have proof of who was behind it, but the timing was too precise to be a coincidence. Retaliation had escalated beyond letters. At the same time, something else was evolving in Willow Creek: unity. The reform movement now had momentum that went beyond Thomas. Residents began sharing stories of board intimidation and selective enforcement that dated back years. Elderly residents spoke of harassment over garden decorations. Young families described mysterious fines appearing after they declined to join certain HOA volunteer committees. One story involved a man who moved after being threatened with foreclosure over a disputed fence height. The pattern was clear. This was not governance. It was control through fear. A turning point came when a single-page document surfaced. It was discovered in a recycling bin behind the community office, likely discarded by someone careless. The document was a handwritten list titled Priority Enforcement, Target Properties. 6 addresses were listed. Thomas's address was at the top. Next to each address were notes, cryptic instructions like repeat inspections, drone survey, and violation watch. It was unmistakable. The board had been tracking and targeting specific homeowners. The discovery changed everything. Thomas presented the document at the next small neighborhood meeting. Shock rippled through the group as each resident realized what it meant. The HOA had not only broken rules, they had premeditated harassment. The document was photographed, copied, and secured. Its existence was undeniable proof of organized retaliation. It was also a weapon powerful enough to destroy the board, if used strategically. But Thomas understood the psychology of people in power. Cheryl would not step down simply because she had been exposed. She would deny, deflect, accuse, and, if necessary, burn everything down to keep control. The reform movement needed to move faster than the board. It was time to shift from gathering evidence to applying pressure. The first phase of pressure was political. Thomas and his allies began canvassing door-to-door with nomination petitions for new board members. They strategically selected candidates who had credibility with different segments of the neighborhood: a retired police officer respected for his fairness, a school principal known for her integrity, a veteran accountant to restore budget transparency, and a single mother who represented families long ignored by the board. Each candidate pledged to serve only 1 year, reform the HOA, and then step down, ensuring no one could accuse them of seeking personal power. The board, unable to block nominations legally under mounting scrutiny, resorted to propaganda. Anonymous flyers appeared around the neighborhood accusing the reform group of wanting to bankrupt the HOA and destroy property values. Someone even created a fake website smearing Thomas as a criminal hacker under federal investigation, an accusation so absurd it only made supporters more loyal. But while many saw through the lies, some residents believed them. Fear was a powerful tool. Phase 2 of pressure was legal. The state investigation into the HOA had now expanded to include interviews with current and former vendors. The forensic accountant uncovered a shell company tied to Cheryl's husband, Trimark Consulting, one of the largest recipients of HOA funds. That revelation triggered a second investigation, this time into criminal misconduct. It was slow-moving, but it changed the tone. Prosecutors were no longer asking whether something was wrong. They were asking how deep it went. The board responded with one final desperate tactic. They froze access to HOA records. Their announcement claimed security concerns, stating that records would be unavailable until further notice. This was a direct violation of state transparency laws. Within 24 hours, Thomas filed a contempt motion in court. The judge granted an emergency order compelling the board to immediately restore access. The board complied publicly, but behind the scenes, files began disappearing from the record server. Financial reports for 2 past years vanished entirely. Vendor contracts were missing pages. Meeting minutes were scrubbed of controversial entries. It was obvious. Cheryl was destroying evidence. The reform group expected this. They had saved everything. Digital backups of every record were stored safely off-site. Every missing document had already been filed with investigators. Cheryl had not erased her crimes. She had only made them more obvious. The board called for a final closed-door meeting, claiming it was to stabilize community leadership. The agenda was confidential, But Michael, still serving as an inside source, revealed the truth. Cheryl planned to dissolve the HOA entirely before the election. If she succeeded, the board could legally distribute remaining funds to outgoing officers and walk away richer than ever, leaving the neighborhood in chaos. The reform group had less than a week to stop it. Everything was as now at stake: the homes, the truth, and the future of Willow Creek. The lawsuit alone would not be enough. This would require something bigger than legal filings or blogs or meetings. This would require a public showdown. The next phase of the legal battle had shifted from reactive defense to a strategic offensive. After the evidence of illegal fines was submitted and the HOA board was backed into a defensive corner, Sam and his legal team decided to dig deeper. The HOA had clearly been operating outside of the law, but now a new question emerged. Why? Why had the board risked so much harassment and intimidation over minor violations and bogus fines? Why did they push for foreclosure over a $50 fee? What was the real motivation? Sam had once believed these board members were simply petty, power-hungry suburban bullies. But now he knew better. Something darker was driving them. Their aggression wasn't random. It was calculated. And if it was calculated, then there was a reason behind it. To uncover that reason, Sam's attorney Mark filed a motion for full financial discovery on the HOA. That included accounting records, bank statements, meeting minutes, contracts with vendors, and all financial transactions from the past 5 years. The HOA's lawyers immediately pushed back, claiming the request was harassment. The judge disagreed. The HOA had chosen to escalate the conflict by attempting foreclosure. Now they had to live with the consequences. But when the HOA finally submitted their financial records, something was immediately suspicious. The transaction logs were messy, incomplete, and in several cases, entire months of financial data were missing. Sam and Mark expected sloppy bookkeeping that was almost guaranteed in a corrupt HOA, but this went beyond incompetence. This looked deliberate. Someone was trying to hide something. That's when Mark brought in a forensic accountant named Lisa. She had built a career out of tearing apart financial fraud schemes with obsessive precision. She poured over thousands of transactions, follow-up bank statements, via and/or payments, and unexplained recurring charges. Within days, she noticed patterns: money flowing to vendors that didn't exist, contractors that performed services that no resident had ever seen, vague descriptions of payments like community improvement fee, administrative maintenance, and security adjustments. None of these descriptions explained the payments, and none were authorized by residents. Then came the breakthrough. A particular vendor had been paid $14,000 every month for landscaping services. But this vendor had no website, no online presence, and no company registration. The bank account tied to the vendor traced back to an LLC created by none other than the HOA president, Greg Turner. Greg hadn't mentioned this business. He had never disclosed any conflict of interest, as required by HOA bylaws. The board had never voted on contracting services from a company owned by one of its own board members. Yet for over 3 years, Greg had been funneling HOA funds directly into his own pocket, under the guise of community landscaping. Worse, those landscaping services were never actually performed. Greg had been pocketing the money while also raising HOA dues and issuing bogus fines to homeowners to cover up his fraudulent withdrawals. He had created a financial empire out of extortion, right in his own neighborhood. This would have been enough to destroy him alone, but the corruption didn't end there. Another vendor, this one listed as a private security company, had billed the HOA more than $89,000 over 2 years. Once again, no resident had ever seen any security patrol, surveillance system, or neighborhood guard. Like before, the payments linked back, not to Greg this time, but to the HOA treasurer, Sharon Myers. She had set up the company under a relative's name but registered the bank account using her own address. None of it was legitimate. Sam had won into this thinking the HOA board was simply abusive. Now it was clear. They were running a criminal operation. The fines were just a smokescreen. The harassment was profit-motivated. Every new fee, every legal threat, every violation notice, that was their business model. Harassment was profitable. Foreclosure threats were profitable. Fear was profitable. They had turned the HOA into a personal ATM. But that wasn't the worst of it. Mixed into the documents marked board-only distribution were lists of targeted homeowners. These people were flagged as non-compliant and high risk. The board compiled personal data on these people, their income, debt levels, lien histories, then weaponized that information to determine who could be pressured hardest. If someone had medical debt, they got fined more aggressively. If someone was a single parent, they were hit with liens. If someone was elderly, the HOA escalated immediately to foreclosure. They had even profiled Sam, marking him as low-risk, compliant personality. They had underestimated him. Sam sat quietly as Lisa revealed every stolen dollar, every forged signature, every fraudulent vote. She found over $780,000 in missing money over 3 years. When Mark saw the totals, he didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply sat still and let the scope of it unfold. This wasn't a civil dispute anymore. This wasn't a neighborhood disagreement. This was racketeering. This was grand larceny. This was organized fraud. The evidence would not just win Sam's case, it would destroy the entire HOA board. But there was a final twist none of them expected. In the deepest archive of meeting notes, buried between generic financial discussions and phony voting logs, Lisa found a scan of a private contract between the HOA board and a land development company. The company had agreed to buy several foreclosed neighborhood homes at low prices if the HOA board successfully acquired control of at least 12 houses. In exchange, the board members were to receive a commission for each foreclosed home that changed hands. That's why the HOA had suddenly become aggressive in foreclosing. That's why they were pushing out long-time residents. That's why Sam had been targeted. The HOA board had planned to gut the neighborhood and sell it to developers. This wasn't just fraud, it was betrayal. Now Sam and Mark had a decision to make. Reveal everything now, or hold it for maximum impact. They chose a more patient path. They would gather everything, every forged document, every deleted email, every falsified vote, and deliver it in one devastating legal strike. Mark contacted state investigators privately. Lisa began preparing forensic summaries for prosecutors, and Sam did the one thing nobody expected. He stayed silent. He didn't confront Greg. He didn't warn the neighbors. He didn't post online. He waited, because the next court date was already scheduled. The HOA thought they were just arguing about a lien, but they had no idea that their entire empire was about to collapse in public. They had tried to crush him for $50. They had made a catastrophic mistake. Sam had the truth, and now he had proof, and he was about to bring it all down. The courtroom was silent as the next hearing began. The HOA board members walked in with smug expressions, still convinced they held power over Sam. They believed this would finally be the day the court ruled in their favor, that the lien would be enforced, that fines would be upheld, and that foreclosure proceedings would be allowed to continue. They thought they still controlled the game. They didn't know the game had already ended. Sam entered calmly with Mark and Lisa, carrying several organized binders and sealed evidence packets. His expression was unreadable, not fearful, not angry, just steady. He knew what was coming, and he was ready to watch it happen. If the HOA wanted a war, then war would be delivered. But it would be done legally, surgically, and with precision. The hearing began with the HOA's attorney confidently presenting their usual claims. They insisted that Sam had willfully violated HOA regulations, failed to maintain his property, and ignored lawful fines. They spoke as if everything was routine, They believed nothing had changed. Then it was Sam's turn. Mark stood and began speaking with calm certainty. He did not argue about the fines, nor did he defend Sam's property maintenance. Instead, he stated that this case had uncovered a much larger issue: systematic fraud, financial corruption, and criminal misconduct by multiple HOA board members. His tone never rose, and he never resorted to theatrics. He simply began laying out proof. One by one, he exposed the falsified fines, the fabricated violation reports, the unauthorized liens, the forged signatures, the altered bylaws, the secret amendments that were never voted on, the predatory foreclosure practices disguised as community enforcement. Then came the financial crimes. Lisa stepped forward with forensic audit results documenting hundreds of thousands of dollars in missing funds. She showed bank statements tracing money from HOA dues directly into personal accounts controlled by board members. She revealed fraudulent vendor contracts tied to the HOA president and treasurer. Page after page of undeniable evidence filled the courtroom. For the first time since the conflict began, the board looked shaken. Their confidence evaporated. They whispered among themselves, their eyes darting nervously, their smugness gone. The judge requested clarity. Mark responded by submitting certified audit records, bank filings, and notarized confirmations from the county clerk. Everything was real, everything was legal, everything was traceable. The judge ordered an immediate pause in the civil hearings. The courtroom was now required by law to notify state authorities of the alleged criminal activity. But Mark wasn't done yet. He submitted sealed documents revealing the secret land development contract, a deal in which foreclosed properties would be quietly transferred to a private developer for a payout. The board had agreed to force homeowners into foreclosure to collect personal commission payments. They had tried to rob people of their homes to profit from their misery. The judge froze, stunned by the level of betrayal laid bare. This was no longer a civil dispute. This was corruption. This was racketeering. This was organized fraud under the guise of community leadership. The courtroom doors opened as state investigators, already alerted ahead of time, entered quietly. They approached the bench with warrants. The HOA lawsuit was no longer the central issue. Criminal prosecution had begun. The board members panicked. Greg tried to object. Sharon began shaking. The secretary broke down before anyone even questioned her. They were escorted out of the courtroom in silence as the judge ordered immediate seizure of all HOA financial records for criminal review. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. Word spread fast, faster than anyone expected. Residents who had feared speaking up suddenly found their voices. Former homeowners who had been forced into foreclosure resurfaced with testimony. Local reporters appeared, camera crews arriving to cover what was quickly becoming a massive suburban corruption scandal. The neighborhood that had once been oppressed by silence now spoke freely and loudly. People who had been bullied, fined, intimidated, and threatened by the HOA banded together. They weren't afraid anymore. The truth had broken the board's control. The HOA funds were frozen. A court-appointed receiver took over finances to prevent more theft. A new election was ordered. Sam was asked to run for HOA president, but he refused. He didn't want power. He only wanted fairness. He recommended forming a transparency committee instead, so no one person could ever control the HOA again. The neighbors voted him into that committee unanimously. Sam could have walked away. He could have sold his house and left the neighborhood behind. But he didn't. He stayed because this was more than a personal victory. It was a stand against corruption, intimidation, and abuse of power. In the end, the HOA board members were charged with multiple crimes, including embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. Plea deals were denied. Sentences were severe. The development deal collapsed. The neighborhood was saved from forced buyout, and new bylaws were created to protect homeowners from predatory actions. Sam won the case, but more importantly, he won justice. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He returned home, sat on his porch, and looked at the house they tried to take from him. The house he had fought to protect. The house they believed they could steal with fear and paperwork. They were wrong. He had discovered something powerful along the way. Not just evidence, but truth. Truth once exposed cannot be buried. Truth once revealed cannot be silenced. And truth, when defended with courage, doesn't just win battles. It changes lives. The HOA thought they owned the neighborhood. They thought they controlled the law. They thought they could crush anyone who resisted. But in the end, they made one fatal mistake. They picked the wrong homeowner to push.